What's going on, vinyl community? Welcome to another episode with Conversations with the Record Spinner. And in today's episode, I am joined by a progressive rock legend. He was the guitarist in Genesis, and he has also had a very successful solo career. I can't believe this is happening. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Steve Hackett. Steve, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dylan. Nice to talk to you again.
Great chat with you as always.
Yeah.
Real quick, before we get into the nitty gritty of it, how have you been holding up amidst what's been going on in the world these days?
Well, it's been a very productive time. The pandemic is getting worse. In some parts of London, 1 in 15 or even 1 in 10 people have this potentially fatal disease. People are falling off the perch by the minute, and we're just waiting to get the vaccine. Apart from that, I had an operation in I think it was just before Christmas, for a kidney cyst.
Oh, gee.
That had to get removed. So for a month, I was out of action and I wasn't able to play at all. But for the past 2.5 weeks or so, I've been playing flat out and doing lots of acoustic playing, less electric, but then I'm halfway through an electric album, so I will be doing that. It's a little bit heavy, the Les Paul, against my wound.
Gotcha.
So I can sit down and play, or so the acoustic is more comfortable at the moment, but it has its rewards and its demands. The acoustic, it's a very beautiful instrument.
Absolutely.
It can be very unforgiving. When you screw up, and there's nowhere to hide.
That is true.
I think with an electric, you can be, dare I say, I think you can be less accurate with it, and it can still sound great.
That's very true. It's like smoke and mirrors, basically. If it's amplified, you can hide some of those, minor nuances. But once it's stripped down, warts and all, as they say.
Warts and all, yeah, and there's very little reliance on, or less reliance on other instruments certainly when you're playing solo on the acoustic. But on this particular album, we've got lots of great play from other people, so I'm thrilled with the sound of it. I love the production. I like the fact that it sounds at times a little bit like a piano, and
really,
I love the idea of trying to make the acoustic guitar, the nylon guitar, sound a little bit like a piano. Yeah, I try and do things on it that sound impossible in one go, but I figured out techniques of doing that with combination of right hand and left hand techniques that enable you to arpeggiate and then do hammering on and hammering off, pulling on and off with the left hand. So it sounds like there's more than one player at times. And of course that takes me right back to starting out with tapping, where you could bypass the use of a plectrum, and you didn't have to do two things simultaneously, hit something with a plec or with your hand, and the note at the same time. That requires a huge degree of accuracy, but tapping, of course, sliding around means that you're using a minimum amount of effort with maximum speed. So yeah, minimum effort, maximum effect.
Gotcha.
Maximum
I was going to say, with just how you were describing how you can make the guitar sound like something completely different, right? When you mentioned that, I immediately thought of when you were in Genesis. I think it's Fountain of Samasis. There's like this organ run right when the song really picks up in the middle. And for the longest time, I thought that was guitar. And then I realized, oh, wait, that's Hammond organ. It just sounds like, I think that was such a cool kind of palette you guys had back then of how you can make something sound like completely different. Like that's
Yeah,
it always takes very careful listening, when it comes to that.
yeah.
It's fascinating.
We used to try and marry up the instruments. I was very aware of the fact that Genesis, even before I joined them, I couldn't quite tell what was guitar and what was keyboard. And I thought that was a tradition that needed to be explored further. So sometimes when I was doing tapping, there might be a salvo of notes going on, and then Tony would double that on. Usually it was electric piano put through a fuzz box. So he was trying to sound like a guitarist, and I was trying to sound like a keyboard.
Yeah.
And somewhere in the middle, it sounded a bit like electric harpsichord kicking in. It was a good effect, and it's something that I still explore even now. It's something I've used from time to time. Don't want to get too hung up on techniques.
Yeah.
The best thing is to have a good melody.
That's important.
If you can have a great melody, you can do it with a minimum of technique. It should be able to survive stripping it right back. Something memorable. And that's a very personal thing, of course. So what might seem memorable to me may not be to someone else, but there have to be certain things that haunt you, certain things that will surface in the imagination, and then, I've got to honor that ghost. I've got to do it.
Gotcha. I was gonna say, just to touch real quick on Genesis. In terms of all the members that have been in Genesis,
yeah,
it goes without saying that you have, I think, in my opinion at least, you've been the most prolific in terms of solo careers, because you were even doing solo albums back when you were in the band, going back with Voyage of the Alkalite in '75, and then everything else. But you've always, like, in your live shows, you've always tapped into doing, the Genesis stuff that you had a heavy hand in crafting, whether it's things like Further Fifth, Blood on the Rooftops. But one of the big obvious projects that you've been pursuing since like the early 2010s, I want to say, is the whole Genesis Revisited project, which you did an album in the 90s, and then in like 2012, I want to say, is when you did the double album where you did all the re-records. What was the main motive of getting back out there and doing a whole album as well as shows worth of material? Because when you went out and toured for those for that album, like the entire thing was all Genesis. What was the motive to get you to do that? Was it a pure case of getting out to fans who really wanted to hear that stuff? Was it something personal for you?
Well, I was frustrated about, two things. I wanted to do music that was more technically demanding than the area that Genesis was heading towards when I left. And so, we headed in different directions. Their music was going to be simpler and more direct. Mine was going to be more complex and more heavily embroidered, to put not too fine a point on it. Somehow, it's so difficult for me to describe this, but once Genesis really finished doing concerts, it seemed to me that both of those eras in which the band had done something equally interesting, whether it was in the 70s or in the 80s or 90s. In the 70s, John Lennon picked up on the band and said some nice things. That was a huge spur to think, we're doing the right thing here. We're doing something with perhaps smaller forces than the Beatles had, because they had all this manpower in the world's ear, and just about every player in the world would play with them at the drop of the hat. We were doing it with less, and I was so very proud of those. And I was worried that so many Genesis fans would feel disenfranchised, both by the fact that the band ceased to exist and the form that it did eventually exist in was something that was very different. The MTV approved era was so very different from the Peter Gabriel era, to put it into two camps, really. the 70s theatrical rock storytelling era versus perhaps the Invisible Touch era, where masses of commercial success, but what was it that fired up musicians? And I think it was the earlier era was the fact that you had music which was pan-genre, because you had one guy in the band who was into soul music and big band music. You've got another guy who's listening to Nina Simone, and you've got Mike Rutherford listening to Led Zeppelin and Judy Collins. Tony and I were having conversations about what was the stuff that he was listening to? Classical stuff, church music, Vaughan Williams, Holst, so much stuff. So all these disparate influences came together in this one band and made this thing that we now refer to with the catch-all progressive music. It's a very long-winded way of saying something that I think that the band was pulling in, several different directions at once. And certain albums, like Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, it's almost as if you've got prototype punk with what the singer's trying to do, and there's an influence of Rachmaninoff going on with the keyboard work, and you get this collision of the two going on, two very strong wills, and everyone else trying to be the glue around this fiery collision. Yeah, it's a bit like the irresistible force meets the immovable object, and yet still, what was going on within the atom didn't shatter it. It was still something cohesive, but it was radical. And that was just one of the albums that we did. Anyway, I thought that all of that era was worth preserving. So I thought, well, how about if I reopened the museum doors in a museum of somewhat of my own making, and wear my curator's cap and unearth a few of the mummies that have been very well preserved, and polish up the jewels on some of the cases of the things that contain some of those long preserved ancient pieces of music. In rock terms, it's ancient. Yeah, I joined Genesis 50 years ago this year. But I still love some of the stuff that we did in that first year. Tracks like Fountain of Salmacis, Water of the Skies, the big symphonic, or the symphonic equivalent, because we had the mellotron, to have organ, to have mellotron, to have electric piano, to have 12 strings, to have electric guitars, and then in a couple of years to be able to pull choirs out of the box with the mellotron once those tapes had evolved, and the use of monophonic synthesizer, all of which are really retro instruments now, but they were cutting edge at the time. I thought, I wonder if I can do this stuff, but present the 70s in a way that seems perhaps not necessarily more slick, but the idea of basing it perhaps less on personality and more a case of making the music itself the star. So it was like, let's strip it back. Of course, Nad does a great job singing that stuff.
Nad Silver, fantastic vocalist.
Singing the traps he was doing. Yeah. And of course I can do some of the, what I think of as some of the great instrumental work with the band. Some tracks tended to be more like instrumentals, although they had vocals. Tracks like Dance on a Volcano, from the beginning of the Phil Collins era with the band, when Phil took over on vocals. We were, for a short time, a four-piece, and we did 2 studio albums and 1 live album, which when I get back to doing shows, I'll be doing the whole of Seconds Out.
Yes, yeah, I saw that was advertised. That's a real treat. Fans would love that.
Yeah. I do that and do full-length versions of the songs that were somewhat marginalized on Seconds Out itself. So it'll be a sort of Seconds Out plus
That's
Uh,
awesome.
yeah, and I'd also fit in some solo stuff as well, and
As always. That's
um,
it's always the good part of the show. I mean, your solo stuff in recent years, in the past, I would say 5 years, has been so consistent for the viewers that are watching at home. Just to kind of showcase them, I have copies on hand.
oh,
Wolflight,
thank you.
which came
Yep.
out in 2015. This actually is probably my favorite of yours. I absolutely
Oh,
adore this album. I mean, literally when this came out, because I think my family and I, we had seen you like multiple times when you came around to the US. This never left
right.
the car. Like it just stayed. We just kept listening to it.
It's very interesting that you're the second person I've spoken to today who said that that was his favorite solo album of mine. So
Really?
it was around about the time where we started doing videos, and I started working with a very interesting Serbian team who put together all sorts of stuff with animals, and I did another uh, video with them beyond Wolflight when we did Behind the Smoke on Night Siren.
All but this one.
Yeah, and there was an extraordinary production that looks like an epic feature film
Yeah,
in
very
places.
much.
That one, Behind the Smoke, I was thrilled with the way that came up. So you've got battle scenes, and you can say, what's a rock guitarist doing there? In the middle of this battle scene, playing guitar. But this director had me moving around. It was quite funny. He said to me, "I'll show you how a rock guitarist moves," and he's got all the moves, and like he's being Jimi Hendrix. I thought, yeah, it's interesting.
That is awesome.
Yeah, I said, well, just treat me like an actor. You're the director. I'll be your actor. I happen to have done the music here, but I want to be directed so you get the best out of me. So I thought, so he's got me doing all this sort of stuff and that,
Yeah.
and practically setting fire to the thing, and it was great fun working with him. He is a real talent. So we've done a few videos together, and other video teams that have been absolutely great. Paul Gosling has been doing wonderful stuff on some of these albums. The stuff that he did for Love Song to a Vampire, which is on Wolflight.
Yeah.
So, in a way, a bit like when everyone abandoned the video era, I started getting involved with it. And so, but I wasn't looking for anything that was going to get shown on MTV. And, many people say, MTV, never heard of it. It's a bit like saying 78. Nobody plays
Yeah.
it. But to have that in conjunction, and sometimes to put them on albums or to use them as something that will pinpoint the music. So we've released the odd video before this current one under Mediterranean sky.
Yeah.
To get the idea of the romance of place and Andalusian heart, which centers on Spain, of course, the Andalusian district. There's Italy with Casa del Fauno. There's one. Let me see the other videos we've done. Yeah, there's one shot largely in Egypt, which is
Wow.
Sirocco, wind that travels through the desert. That one I don't think has been released yet, but it's a lovely looking video as it happens, just because you get the music, and right at the end I go into one of the tombs that looks like it was painted just yesterday, one of the most amazing places. So that was an amazing visit to Egypt, as it was an amazing visit to Petra. And when I was staying with my wife and I, we were staying with the Bedouin people out under the stars with a fire. Just absolutely divine. And of course, I've got my notebook out the whole time. Other people were taking photographs. I was making notes, because that's how I remember things with music. Music seems to remember me. I remember music. Somehow that conveys its magic. So I can paint with sounds in the same way that my father was able to paint many landscape paintings of exotic places with paint itself, either with oil or with acrylic and watercolors. He was very gifted. And my version is to try and landscape and paint a picture, but to do it with music, or you might say it's a film for the ear, story, but to try and inhabit the area and feel that you're at one with it and telling its story, even though I'm a visitor. But in spirit, I can understand the music of Armenia, of Azerbaijan, the Mugam, which is like Arabian jazz.
Mm-hmm.
And I love all these exotic instruments that wouldn't normally be found perhaps on even on a rock album, let alone an acoustic album. So it's great to mix all those things, and I think it fuses into a more it's a wider palette. That's how I see it.
I was gonna say, you like almost answered a question that I was going to ask you, because with your solo work, there's a lot of, different kind of influences going. And I think it also corresponds with, like you were saying, that you and Joe, your wife, like to travel and go to all these different places. Do you,
Yeah.
when you're in a creative kind of atmosphere, do you feel like you're a sponge that soaks up whatever culture, like you're, kind of, I guess, visiting, like whether it's different countries and whatnot? And also, you just said yourself, you're a fan of like different, instruments that can be used and, within certain contexts. Do you feel like you just absorb, whatever is surrounding you when you create?
Yes. There have been very few times when I've been somewhere where I've immediately heard the music that I wanted to record when I was going away from it, describing it. So it's a bit like the future and the present come together. When I was first in Cairo, for instance, and it was only for a day, first of all, and we were standing opposite the Sphinx, and I thought, for us, we Westerners, this is the most exotic place on earth to see this extraordinary thing, this extraordinary creation. And I had the notebook out, melodies were coming to me the whole time. And I did a track on a rock album the track was called Two Faces of Cairo, because I could see that there was the magnificence of the old kingdom, the pyramids, the Sphinx, all of that. But at the same time, there was people who were living in the tombs in an area that they called, a city of the dead.
Yeah.
At a place without streetlight. And you could see these shadowy forms as we were driving past in our very privileged bus, along with the rest of the tourists. And I felt that at that time, and this was pre the revolution that they had, I thought, how long is this possible? There was Muslim worshippers doing all the right things in terms of being as religious and as holy as they possibly could be. But at the same time, there was this huge elephant in the room, which was the idea of poverty, and almost like the equivalent of the India's untouchables. And I felt that there were two sides to it, as I say, the stuff they want you to see and the stuff they don't want you to see. Now, returning to Egypt and seeing all sorts of wonderful things like whirling dervish dancers, incredible percussionists, the antiquities, the journey on the Nile, and you're doing the route that Antony and Cleopatra did in ancient times, and it's all still there, and most of it. The modern world doesn't impinge upon it. It's lined with palm trees, and if it wasn't for the fact that it's modern mode of transport, you could really forget yourself and think, well, this is a timeless experience. This is a timeless river. This is something that travels through many countries. But we'd been to Ethiopia. We'd seen the source of the Nile. We'd been right up there. We'd done all of that. But all of this informs the music, is what I'm trying to say. Sometimes those things come together immediately, and you think, I've just got to get this across somehow in music. I've just got to. It can't just be a visit where I'm, staying in a sumptuous hotel and being bourgeois about it. I've got to earn this. I've got to earn this privilege.
I hear you.
That's how it feels to me.
I feel like for as many photos that can be taken where you go, there's something more gratifying, I guess, with creating something based out of your adventures. So I totally understand that. But with what you were saying though, like when you were in Egypt and you had to sit down and write, do you write guitar tabs, or is it just like, how do you go about like documenting this kind of stuff?
When I don't have an instrument with me, as I usually don't when I'm traveling to exotic realms, I just tend to write top line and chords,
Okay.
and worry about the detail when I've got an instrument with me. I mean, I suppose I can work out quite a few things. Um, I'm not gifted enough to be able to orchestrate entirely on my own. I can't do that. I rely on Roger for that, and I rely on having a guitar to hand to discover harmonies and find extra parts and what have you. There has to be that. It has to be a collaboration. I think no one has got all the answers all the time. I mean, even people like Mendelssohn and Max Bruch worked with virtuoso violinists to, bring certain concertos to light. So you need the virtuoso, you need the orchestrator, and it's a collaboration between the two. That's how it used to work in the old days. And I guess I'm old school in that I do that. It sounds very boring. Sometimes recording is a little bit like, it's not a spectator sport. It goes at the speed of watching paint dry as, one little harmony gets added, and people might think there's nothing happening when we're sitting there in a studio context. But I'm thrilled as I see it take shape. I mean, of course, it's wonderful to be able to go out and hire a symphony orchestra, and occasionally in my life I've been able to do that and see, the dots are written out, and then the conductor lifts his arms and the orchestra takes flight. And that's a wonderful thing when you hear it happening, just as it's written. But I find that the way we tend to work, which is one instrument at a time, sometimes matched with samples, sometimes it's samples, sometimes it's real, and we're constantly assessing things so that we audition this sound, we audition that sound, the combination of the two, the man, the machine, the woman, all of that. Christine Townsend playing violin, Christine Townsend playing viola. How many tracks should we do of that? Of the first violin, the second, etc., etc. We layer it all up, so it's like a cake with an awful lot of ingredients in it, and very slow process of baking it. But we finished this album in a couple of months, which isn't bad,
Really?
considering it was practically from scratch. Yes.
That's awesome. I was going to say, just to touch on the new album. You've mentioned it, Under Mediterranean Sky, comes out as a film in this interview. It's coming out next week on January 22nd.
Yes.
Were you in the process of working on a new album at the time, or was it just a case of being in lockdown and realizing that you had time on your hands? Like, what exactly, like, were you already in the process of working on this stuff, or what did it just all kind of happen to coincidentally?
We were halfway through an American tour. Suddenly, every state closed down. My wife and I, Joe and I, got the last flight back from Philadelphia, literally the last flight. And straight away when we were back, we thought, we've got extra time. I was about to release an autobiography. I was able to add a few more words to that. I didn't expect to be able to do that. We immediately got on with doing the acoustic album. I perhaps didn't think it would be done quite so quickly, so we moved on to some rock stuff. So we're 45 minutes into new rock stuff at the moment.
Awesome.
I've got to go back and assess it. There are lots of different players from all around again. At least 2 American fabulous drummers, and others. And we just have to see what happens now, because normally we can work with everyone from everywhere and travel, but obviously we have to make these get-togethers virtual.
Yeah.
And it's got to be a meeting of minds. through technology rather than come in, have a cup of tea, have a drink, have a sandwich. Here we go. That's the way it's always worked, and I've loved working face to face with friends. But there are times when there are people I'm working with at times who I've never actually met, but I've met their work, and there's been a desire to want to do something. There'll be a recommendation, and I may see them playing on video, and there's been all sorts of stuff going on. But albums, I think, no longer get made in the way that people imagine they do. You know what it's like, these 1960s films. Hey, we're the Monkees. Yeah, we all met at school and we all got together and we all were in one room. We
Yeah.
the guy wrote a song and then we went out and then we became famous next week. It doesn't quite work out like that. It's very different. And so if it sounds too much like a test tube baby using a performance from Azerbaijan recorded in Hungary, or a drummer in Iceland being rationalized in London. The last couple of rock albums I've done, there've been 20 people on it from all over the world. So there might be a house band, but it's expanded. The elastic band goes on, casting a very wide net over the whole of the globe. And whoever's an interesting player that I haven't worked with, I might get a chance to work with them and discover his instrument or her instrument. Like we had some wonderful sitar on the last rock album, at the Edge of Light, and that was Shima Mukherjee, who's on that, who's a fantastic virtuoso sitar player from a family of virtuosos who were teaching Ravi Shankar long before he was hooking up with the Beatles. So it's a huge tradition of this stuff. And then there might be the use of the Peruvian charango, which is a small, short-scale stringed instrument, which I've used it on various albums, and I've used it on this latest one, Under a Mediterranean Sky, on a track called The Memory of Myth. And we wanted to do something which was in a Greek style. My wife wrote the orchestral melody that's right at the beginning, unaccompanied violin. But at one point, the charango functions like, it's a little bit like a mandolin or a little bit like a bouzouki, and I'm playing it in that style with fast trill, and it's doubling some stuff that's on the nylon guitar. It's a lovely combination. It sounds like folk music.
That's awesome.
Very, very beautiful, lovely thing to work with. I want to use more of it. I want to do all sorts of things. I want to have a balalaika. Perhaps other people will get there first. I want a bouzouki. I want a balalaika. I want.
Gotcha. You'll get there. I can assure you, it'll happen. Now this album, Under Mediterranean Sky, it's your first acoustic album, and is it about 18 years? Because 2003 was the last one.
Is it? I can't remember when the last one was out. A tribute. Was it out in 2003 or was it 2005? I'm trying to remember.
Right around there.
Was it around that, or was it 2008? My memory's a little hazy. I can tell you when each Genesis album came out, but when it comes to my own albums, there've been so many of them, and
Gotcha.
the old grey cells don't quite recall everything.
Gotcha.
But yeah, it's once every few years, maybe once every decade or so, or sometimes it'll be even longer. But all I can say is I really loved doing this particular album, and if people like it, there might be another one like this.
Yeah, I'm all for it.
Hard on the heels of it. Because once you get going, that's another voyage of discovery. Once you find some different tunings on a really great guitar, and then suddenly every chord is a surprise. It means you can't fall back on the usual trajectories. There is no technique to fall back on with the left hand. Everything is discovery. It's like having a ukulele. The chords are different. It's like a banjo. The chords are different.
Yeah.
Both of which I've worked with a little bit over the years. But I like this. I like not knowing anything. It's
interesting.
heading into darkest Africa. We've got to cut a swathe through this.
I was gonna ask you, because like in your live shows, like they always start out big with the full band and everything, but there's always that middle part where the band departs and it's just you with like a nylon acoustic guitar.
Yeah,
And sure, even though like there were things such as like tapping and sweep picking that you had, basically kind of jump started back in the 70s. Do you feel like you're able to embrace more of your abilities while playing acoustic?
well, I was just thinking about this right back when I was working with Steve Howe and we had GTR. We
Yes.
used to start the show acoustically. We started out with acoustic guitars. We both did a set separately, then we came together, and then we introduced the entire band. And it was a way of getting aside, perhaps, of the individuals, which you may not have gotten if you come in hard. And now we're going to play the hit single to start off the set. Nothing wrong with that, but it was a way of perhaps being more subtle in an era, the 1980s, which was less subtle. Let's face it, the tail was wagging the dog much more at that time, where the pressure was on to achieve maximum sales as quickly as possible. And record companies were not functioning in a relaxed way. It was almost as if it was Hollywood, and they were the investors, and you had to account for your every doodle practically. Luckily, we're in an era where things have calmed down. Music is back in the hands of musicians and singers and orchestrators again.
I was gonna
So
say
it's a freer time, and that's closer in spirit, I think, to the 1970s, where experiments were a prerequisite to getting an audience.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's almost like with artists, they look at their albums as it's their art, it's their craft, but in the
Yeah,
eyes of the major corporate labels, it's a product. They need to sell
yeah,
it somehow. They need to
yeah,
demand a single. But I
yeah,
totally agree. Music now, it's more freeing. Artists that are in the pop vein, they have their producers and everything working for them. But you're
yeah.
right though. Like luckily now with the internet and also with independent labels and such, it's much more of a freeing atmosphere. So I
Yes.
totally agree with you on that. But since this channel of mine is a vinyl channel, I'm kind of curious as to what your thoughts are in terms of the format of vinyl coming back to the forefront of the music buying public.
Well, I think that the things that vinyl has got going for it are, and of course, you have to take into account that people like things for different reasons. Vinyl with rock gives extra compression, sometimes more distortion, and gives the music a certain power that CDs don't necessarily have. I'm not saying CDs are bad, far from it. I'm saying that you're buying super clean versus the turbocharged aspect of the music that's being informed by everything, by the room, by the very turntable, the pickup, all of that, the hum. And so you've got extra depth of that. It may be sympathetic to the music. In other instances, it may distract, because if you've got something that's very delicate, acoustic, and you've got less than pristine vinyl, and you're hearing it going around scratching, it's not necessarily going to flatter everything. So if I'm listening to classical music, I would prefer to hear it on CD. Funnily enough, when I was in Serbia at one point with a Hungarian band, we were staying somewhere which was absolutely beautiful, and out in the fields, and it looked a little bit like The Sound of Music. It was log cabins and the glorious stuff. Julie Andrews was going to appear any moment. And
Yeah.
they started playing after breakfast. They started playing ABBA. Would you believe? On this huge jukebox, and this thing was practically the size of a room, and they were playing singles. And you know what? It sounded bloody marvelous. And I don't even know if it was mono or not, but the power of the thing was extraordinary. So never not mono, never not vinyl, but be aware that whatever your fetish, you know, there's someone that will listen to you.
That's true. There's always a market for everything.
Yeah.
But for myself, like when it comes to vinyl, I mean, of course, sound quality aside, and just like you said, it's the turbocharged equivalent of a nice clean CD. I love the idea of listening to an album from start to finish in terms of how it flows and everything. When you work on your solo albums, are you always thinking in that context of this is how it's going to start, we'll have a little breakdown in the middle, this is how it ends, or do you usually approach that later on once everything is finished?
Well, the sequencing of an album is a very hard thing to do until you've got all the contenders in. You know, normally you're thinking, oh, this is my strongest track. I probably should have this at the beginning. Or you might have a short sequence of atmosphere before that track comes in. But it's best usually to wait. And once you've got all the contenders, it's a bit like sequencing an album is a bit like framing a painting. But until you know what's really in there, you can't really come up with the best frame for it. I mean, like for instance, my dad painted a really beautiful painting of the Fairy Glen in Wales, and where some of our family came from, his side of the family, and he was evacuated there in the war at one point. And this, I don't know how, I don't know how I got into this one, but it was just such an extraordinary thing. I've lost my thread here with this, thinking about my dad. It suddenly all becomes emotional when I'm thinking about that. But I like to think he might have approved of the way I've gone at some of this music. I'll remember the thread in a minute when it's far too late. But it's because it's heading into the evening here, and you know, my
would you say that
brain cells are going.
do you buy vinyl yourself, or do you just simply appreciate the format? Like, do you have a turntable? Like, do you invest in all that?
You know what? You know what? When I moved house, I had to get rid of a whole bunch of things, many of which I wish I had now. And we were going to move this year. We were going to, you know, do the major investment, do the upgrade. And
wow, nice.
But obviously, because of the situation, that hasn't really been possible. So once we get back to shows, I think maybe in a year or two's time after that, we may be able to do that. And so, yeah, definitely, I want that. I want to have my playrooms with these things.
Yeah,
that's it. You know.
I do have to say though,
gymnasium, torture chamber, recording studio.
Quite the assortment. I do have to say though, I mean, I absolutely love, you know, how your albums are represented on vinyl. I mean, of course they're all available on CD, but like they come with the nice gatefold jackets and just for the sake of show and everything, like you get like artwork for each individual track. And for the viewers at home, check out this. I have the limited version of At the Edge of Light. Look at that. That is cool. You don't get that on a CD, you know.
No, you
looks
don't.
Really awesome.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the packaging of vinyl. When I was a kid buying vinyl, if I bought something that I considered to be an amazing album, I would be sitting there with it on my knees, either in the bus or on the tube, subway as you call it, and it was a thing of importance that I just assumed every other passenger in the vehicle would be thinking, hey, this guy's cool because he's got the latest blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And of course, people don't think like that, but it was important to me and to the music. It was important. Yeah, it was a badge of courage, of office, and everything, because music had changed the world. It had eradicated prejudice. It had done so much. It had mainstreamed the world. The Beatles had sung All You Need Is Love to billions of people, and the world was hooking up, and if not singing the same song, certainly it was listening to the same song, and the message was great. And I think that's what we need to try and work on again. Of course, I'm lamenting the fact that we are currently in the crisis of COVID and the crisis of Brexit, where in order to be able to just tour Europe is being made incredibly difficult, being dragged back several centuries, it seems, whereas we should be celebrating what's best in the world as opposed to what's merely local. If you've got a brain tumor, you want the best surgeon in the world to work on it if you can afford it, right? You're not really worried that that's the guy on the corner. So I think, as with everything, it should be the pursuit of excellence. And here endeth the lesson.
I was gonna say, real quick, because I just showcased, just the main solo stuff. In terms of like live releases, it seems like every tour you do, there is always a new CD, DVD package, which is great because to me, like, those are permanent souvenirs. And for anyone out there that has not been so much in the loop, like I had mentioned with Steve, the Genesis Revisited stuff, they actually released this past year. This is live at the Royal Albert Hall.
Yeah.
This is if you want all Genesis stuff, this is something to check out. And then the most latest live release was this, Selling England by the Pound in Spectre Mornings, live at Hammersmith.
Yeah.
By the way, I mean, I'm sure you have a say in this stuff, but thank you for putting the live stuff on vinyl, because for me, I buy up, the vinyl format at any time. And like I saw that this got a release on the format, I was so excited. But real quick, before we wrap this all up, in terms of your older albums, like Voyage of the Acolyte and Please Don't Touch, Spectral Mornings, I know that there was a box set. It was like the Charisma Years box set a couple years back. Are there any possible plans for another pressing of it, or are there any plans to perhaps reissue the album separately to the public? Because unfortunately, I hate to say this, because obviously I buy CDs as well, but I am lacking vinyl copies of your early work. Are there any plans for anything to come out in the future?
That's entirely possible. There were two box sets which had basically had everything, but I know that Inside Out are keen on doing more. This is a very general conversation. Are keen on doing more vinyl, and I think that'll be great for enthusiasts. We try and release in every format if we can, and it's funny how things from the distant past, like 1975, and even this sort of 50 years since Genesis, blah, 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 blah. The amount of interest in the past seems to be huge. And that's marvelous for me, because we thought when we were doing these albums back in the day that they were just little local experiments, and nobody imagined that at the time when we were just hoping to get our recording contract extended, nobody thought that we were making anything that might be regarded as classics. We weren't that confident at that time. We always felt that there was room for improvement, as there always is. Of course, things can always be different. Things can always be better. And yet, some things along the way, you look back and you think, they aren't bad, are they? Some of these things are very good.
I was going to say, it's almost as if you were basically just living in the moment at that given time. You weren't thinking to yourself, how will this stand up against everything else in 30, 40, or, at this point, 50 years? But it's nowadays you can think back and it's like, yes, that was a great snapshot in time. And it stood up, to the test of time, because there is still a crowd, an audience out there that still wants to hear it. I mean, I'm blessed that, my parents raised me on the great progressive rock, artists, whether it's bands like Genesis, King Crimson, I mean, I'm going to embarrass her by saying this. my mother was the definition of a Genesis fangirl. She has a scrapbook of just, all this stuff,
Right.
and all the books by Armando Gallo. And I would see this as a kid, and that's how I became, informed by, Genesis and all the great progressive rock bands. But no, it's still great to see that there is an audience, both young and old, but young at heart, that still enjoy it.
There's nothing wrong with inheriting something from an earlier audience. I mean, that was my introduction to classical music. It was introduced to me via a generation or two removed, and but of course, when you're listening to stuff written by composers who were born in 1685, somehow looking back at that and thinking it's contemporary because of the amount of detail, and you marvel at it in the same way that you marvel at a Constable painting. You see that every leaf appears to have been painted, or so it seemed to me when I was first looking at it. It seems as if when I look back at the 1950s, I feel more removed from that era where light entertainment had really taken over from this sort of through composed thing in the 1930s and the 1920s. Yes, there were great things being written, but there were a lot of really questionable things in the charts. It wasn't called bubblegum back then, but there was some extraordinary stuff that we had in England, and I mean they're mere curios now, whereas the work of Bach and Beethoven and Miles Davis lives on, and Hendrix, and Paul Butterfield, as far as I'm concerned, and on and on. Segovia, Peter Green, the late Peter Green,
Fleetwood Mac,
the great Peter Green, and Eddie Van Halen, who's passed on with extraordinary skill and so much fire. It's been an extraordinary time for saying goodbye to guitarists. I feel lucky and privileged that I'm still here to be able to engage with the medium and still make a noise for a living.
I take it, is that the plan, just to keep creating until?
Yes.
That's awesome.
Until I go bang, yeah, that's right. Until I go, until the air is out of my tires. That's it. But now my only problem is I have another interview to do in a moment. So
gotcha. I was going to say
the honourable thing and address that as well. So well, it's been great talking again to you.
Yes, I was going to say thank you so much, Steve, for chatting with me today. This was awesome. If you guys all enjoyed this, please go ahead, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support the channel, be sure to check me out on Patreon. See you guys in the next video, and most importantly,
wonderful. All the best.
Yes, thank you, Steve.
And to your entire audience of listeners and watchers. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All the best.